many people can vote for him. Because after all, here's the weird thing: elections don't change anything. We talk so much about the campaigns, but if you look over the last 50 or 60 years, polls very rarely shift. Theresa May, obviously, is a bit of an exception, but rarely, really, very rarely do polls shift. And most people have probably made up their minds, even if they don't think they've made up their minds, they probably have made up their minds on the day the election is called. So there is an argument. Why don't they just have this is their chance they're always complaining they don't have enough time. Why don't they just take this chance to have 6 weeks off, 6-week holiday, come back and find out how the people voted? That's how I do it anyway.
Yeah, it's Matt Chorley on Times Radio, joined by Dominic Sandbrook, podcaster, historian, Times columnist, and chronicler of modern British history. I was going to say for the 1950s. That's basically the period you like the best, isn't it, Dominic?
What, the 50s? No, the 70s.
Onwards, 50s onwards.
Yeah,
yes,
50s onwards.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah,
50s onwards.
50s onwards.
So, we are in the midst of a general election campaign. It's the first July election since 1945. So, sort of in your realm of expertise, where would you place this general election thus far in the league table of elections?
Well, you know what? I was thinking about this. Nobody talked about league tables of elections or elections being interesting at all until 1964. So 64 was the first one where people really paid attention to election campaigns. They did it because they were just copying America. So in America, you'd had the 1960 election between Kennedy and Nixon, which is really the first big televised election. And a guy called Theodore H. White wrote a classic book called The Making of the President, 1960. And after that, people in Britain, and starting a trend that has continued to the present day, thought, oh, let's be like America. They have very exciting elections. So Anthony Howard and Richard West wrote an incredibly boring book, which nobody listened to this will ever have read or indeed heard of, called The Making of the Prime Minister, 1964, about that titanic clash between Harold Wilson and Sir Alec Douglas-Home. And obviously, it's incredibly boring because nothing really happens in a British election. So we think elections are interesting because we are conditioned by the BBC sending 7,000 journalists every January to cover the US presidential primaries, which are exciting because they're a horse race between all the different contenders. But the general election bit, which is after the US conventions, when people are just going, they're flying to Kalamazoo and shaking hands and stuff, that's actually quite boring because that's just people firing up their base. And that, I think, is what a British general election is. It's, Sunak and Starmer, they go to target constituencies and they shake hands. And journalists, I don't mean to be rude to any of the political correspondent classes. Journalists try their damnedest to extract meaning and excitement out of, Starmer eating a cake or Sunak smiling at a child or whatever it might be. But actually, so anyway, this is a massive preamble before saying, I think it's actually really boring and nothing much has happened. And that's completely standard because that's what people say in every general election, by and large. The only one that I think is really genuinely interesting is February 1974. So that's Ted Heath, 3-day week, miners' strike. It's against the backdrop of an implosion of the economy. Labour have an incredibly left-wing manifesto. The kind of thing that would, Keir Starmer would the colour would drain from his face if he saw the Labour manifesto in 1974. Redistribution of economic power in favour of working people and their families and nationalisations and all that sort of stuff. And of course, it's against the backdrop of bombs going off all the time. So 74 feels quite an apocalyptic election. But the rest of them, Mrs. Thatcher practicing wrapping cream eggs in a cream egg factory in 1979. Michael Foot's platform falls apart in 1983. There's a massive Tory wobble in 1987 when the opinion polls show that seem to be a bit tighter than they would like. All these kinds of things. It's really it's not even a storm in a teacup. It's more of a storm in a thimble.
It's interesting. When you go back to 64, it wasn't just that people were copying what was happening. Howard Wilson was doing that. He was copying, looking to JFK. Is it also to do with the fact that, the rise of mass media, TV, glossy magazines and all of that, it became, instead of politics being a thing that went on somewhere else and people, if you really wanted to, you could read the gallery reports in the Times, but most people didn't. was suddenly it's showbiz, and
Yeah.
therefore, it's game show. It's probably the rise of the game shows coincides with it as well.
Yeah, totally, Matt. I think that's exactly right. I think it's a TV phenomenon. Of course, there were campaigns before, and the newspapers had front pages and whatnot. But actually, if you were to go back to even the 50s, when actually mass participation elections, the highest turnouts we've ever had, very tight elections, particularly the early 50s. But actually, you look at the front pages, often the campaign's not the main story. And actually, when it is the main story, they're tiny, tiny things. Mr. Attlee has just given a speech in Nuneaton about whatever. It's all quite small scale stuff. I think what you had is TV changed it. So TV accelerated what was already a sort of slightly presidential focus. I mean, that's not a new thing, by the way. That was the case with Gladstone and Disraeli. But I think, let's say, in Gladstone and Disraeli's time, when it was quite presidential, people perceived the parties through the sort of lens of those personifications of their principles. But at that period, I think it was fairer to say that you had 650 or however many it was then different contests taking place, and that local newspapers played a bigger part than they do now. So people thought of them as local contests, whereas I think now, obviously, people don't really think of elections by and large as local contests, but they perceive it through the televised and even now actually social media clips presentation of the main characters. So I do think you had a change maybe in the 60s, and now we're at a new phase, because actually who's following the election on TV these days? Honestly, most people are probably following it. What are they following it on? Facebook, Instagram, TikTok? So the parties are sort of scrabbling to deal with that new reality.
I was wondering that as well, actually, because I suppose I don't know what it is, is it the post-television age that we're in?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously millions of people still watch TV, but we're also, so everyone is so much more conditioned to cynically approaching everything that comes to you. So whether it's, seeing a TV or like seeing a party political broadcast or a poster or a visit, there's sort of everyone now. It's not just sort of cynical hacks. Everyone knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
So they can sort of see what they're up to. So it doesn't land. It's an odd relationship now. Whereas previously you'd have watched Margaret Thatcher in the chocolate factory or whatever and thought, that's nice, she's doing that.
Yeah.
There's that visit. That's because they like defence. Suddenly everyone's going, oh, he's only got that flag because he's trying to show he's patriotic, or he's only with those young people to show he's got. There's a sort of cynicism now.
There is, definitely, absolutely, there is. I think we've seen behind the mask, as it were. So we're all conscious that we're watching a contrivance, and I think it is much more cynical than it used to be, right? So if you go back to I've spent far too much time watching kind of party political broadcasts and interviews from the 1970s. And the standing thing about those 70s interviews is they will say, the Shadow Chancellor, Mr. Healy, and on will come Dennis Healy, and he will talk in a completely free and unspun way about his platform. And he will be, he'll think before he answers a question, and he doesn't come in with the tack lines, and he doesn't, all of that sort of stuff, or Geoffrey Howe or whoever it might be. I think now the fact that we're conscious that they do that actually explains why people are not really interested. What is the point in watching, a clip of Keir Starmer meeting a load of people in wherever, Huddersfield? Because we all know that every single element of that, right down to the people standing there, the ordinary voters holding their little posters or whatever, that it's all completely contrived and confected. And actually, what I wonder is whether this is just actually the last detritus of an older way of campaigning. And in the future, 10 or 20 years hence, we'll move to a completely different way altogether. That where actually that thing of them trudging around meeting people, the sort of fake meetings with people in supermarkets, that's a leftover really from the days of walkabouts. Actually, Harold Wilson was the first person to do a walkabout, 1970, and he was copying the Queen. The Queen had done one on a Commonwealth tour, a tour of Australia, gone really well, and Wilson was the first person who said, "I'm going to go and meet the people," and it went really, really well. And then he lost the election, so I guess that tells us.
But it's interesting because he wants I don't know how you get the genie back in the bottle. I don't know who's to blame, if it's politicians and spin doctors, or the media, or voters, or maybe we're all sort of culpable. That actually, if Rishi Sunak just said, "Look, I'm not going to go around the country,"
right? If
because it's a nonsense.
If he did a Steve Baker and went on holiday, or you
went on holiday,
or you could do. I see Ed Davey has gone to the other extreme, hasn't he? He's deconstructing the whole thing by treating it as like a family day out, going on water rides, falling off paddle boards, all of that. You know, it's a succession of ludicrous photo ops, which I suspect will do quite well for him, because frankly, most people had never heard of him before the election began. And they'll see this guy. You know, there's these two incredibly boring, slightly identical people walking around the country, you know, making pained small talk. And then there's Ed Davey having a whale of a time on a water slide. And I think people quite like to see that. So maybe that's one way of, maybe either you sort of subvert the entire form of election campaigning, or as you said, you just don't bother. You do a Stanley Baldwin or something. You're like, sod it, I'll go on holiday. You know, people can vote for him. Because after all, here's the weird thing: elections don't change anything. We talk so much about the campaigns, but if you look over the last 50 or 60 years, polls very rarely shift. Theresa May obviously is a bit of an exception, but rarely, really very rarely do polls shift. And most people have probably made up their minds, even if they don't think they've made up their minds, they probably have made up their minds on the day the election is called. So there is an argument. Why don't they just have this is their chance they always complain they don't have enough time. Why don't they just take this chance to have 6 weeks off, 6-week holiday, come back and find out how the people voted? That's how I'd do it anyway.
Well, we've done very well, because it took 10 minutes for the first mention of Stanley Baldwin.
Very good. Thank you.
So you've done very well then. Explain why, if people don't know, if they haven't listened to the rest of history or read your columns and books and things, why is Stanley Baldwin not the most well-known of the prime ministers?
Should be then.
What exactly? So why is he on your pedestal?
So I just like Stanley Baldwin. I like his political persona. He was prime minister 3 times between the wars. He's a serious man, Stanley Baldwin. He gave up 10% of his fortune anonymously to help pay off the national debt at the end of the First World War, because he felt guilty that his family firm, Baldwin's and iron makers, had made so much money from the war. So that's something from which our politicians could definitely learn. He is a sort of small c conservative, Baldwin. He's a paternalistic politician, and he always gets a bad press because Churchill dissed him in his memoirs, and Churchill, a much bigger, more charismatic personality, eclipses him. But you can argue that it's thanks to Baldwin and his style of politics, which is very consensual, aimed at dampening down ideological differences and so on. Of course, he's still a partisan, he's still a political operator, but it's because of him that Britain goes into the Second World War as united and consensual as it does, and that under a different leader, indeed Churchill, Britain would have gone in a much more conflicted and divided country, which would have made it much harder to come together in the circumstances of 1940. So Baldwin deserves a lot of credit for that. He's a man of the Midlands, which I like. He looked great in a tweed suit. He took long holidays, which I admire. And he didn't take himself or politics too seriously, which I think is a really, really important thing for a politician. So he's a tremendous man, and everybody should pay him homage.
Is it also partly because of he was a man of his time, that actually Stanley Baldwin would not reach the top of politics in 100 years later, in 2024?
Oh, that's a good question, because actually I'm not sure I agree with you, because Baldwin was brilliant at using the media. He's the first great radio politician in Britain. So nobody had really mastered it before him. And if you do, like me, spend far too much time on YouTube watching old political clips, and you compare him with, let's say, Ramsay MacDonald, who was his Labour opponent, and is much better known, Ramsay MacDonald, I would say. If you watch them giving their sort of newsreel performances, MacDonald holds his lapels in that kind of way that people did in the late Victorian period, and he shouts like he's addressing like the audience at miles away. Now, he's addressing a public meeting. That's what people did. Baldwin was the first person to speak to the camera and to talk to the viewer or listener on a kind of individual basis, to say, well, you and I know that. And what the other thing he did, which was brilliant, is basically saying, you and I both despise politics, really, don't we? It's very boring, but I just happen to be a politician by some dreadful accident, and maybe you lend me your vote. And now that works really well. The anti-politician politician, we're all very familiar with that today. So actually, I think in some ways, Baldwin's emollient style you could imagine that today he would, if he transformed that to different kinds of new media, he would do very well.
In fact, you've reminded me that when I wrote about him in my book, 50 Places That Changed British Politics, because he gave a speech in, I think it must have been, I think was it 28, 29? He gave a speech in Bristol. It was the first time that it was heard in 9 or 10 other places, because they sort of laid Marconi cables across the West Country.
Nice.
Because he recognised the power of reaching people using technology. And I think they put up a photo or sort of projection of him in each of these village halls. And they all just sort of sat quietly and essentially listened to the radio. Yes. But it was obviously more than that because it was sort of being broadcast directly to them.
Yeah.
It was just really interesting to think of someone being this was like properly cutting edge technology. Totally. They were sort of laying the cables.
That's what makes
he also said, I've just found the quote as well. He, I think this was in the speech he was giving. He said, the appetite which seeks for a fresh sensation in politics, if not every day, at least on Sunday, is a depraved appetite.
Yeah, wow.
And I think that is, that was an extraordinary attack on sort of the Sunday papers and Laura Kuenssberg. But yeah, his idea that you stop trying to look for some fresh new thing all the time in politics.
He had a terrible feud, didn't he, with the press barons, with Lord Rothermere and Lord Beaverbrook, and he famously accused them. He said he basically accused them of being prostitutes, power without responsibility. As you say, the trademark of the harlot down the ages, or something like that. So you can imagine he would have great fun today with like the press barons and all that kind of thing. And his sort of, I can imagine, you think how cross people get about the cost of, the prime ministerial plane or whatever. Boredom would take colossal periods of the year and go off to Aix-les-Bains in France, strolling around, taking the waters and stuff. Because his attitude was, politics will just look after itself. You don't need me back at home interfering. And you could argue, if you were a very reactionary person like me, that actually would Britain be any worse if our politicians took slightly longer holidays?
In fact, we had exactly that conversation on the show this week. We were talking about recess and how the recesses actually have got shorter over time.
Yeah.
Because we've somehow equated Parliament sitting and passing laws with sort of, government. That's a virtue and good government. And as long as they're there and they're voting and they're passing some laws, then they must be doing something. I suppose the alternative is you'd hope that at some point we'd reach the period where all the laws are fine.
It's done. Politics is finished now. We have all the laws.
We've finished politics. We've got all the laws we need. Just let's disappear properly into the weeds now, Dominic. Let's talk about Butskellism.
Wow, that is the weeds.
And but it's interesting because there's an interesting parallel to what is going on right now in politics. But explain to the few people who don't know.
Surely everybody
knows
this.
What is Butskellism?
So in February 1954, The Economist had an article in which they invented a character called Mr. Butskell. So this was a conflation of the Conservative then Chancellor, Rab Butler, who's the kind of great Conservative politician of the 50s and 60s who never becomes Prime Minister. And the guy who'd been Chancellor before him, who had been Labour's Chancellor and then becomes Labour leader, who's Hugh Gaitskell. So they conflate these Butler and Gaitskell to make Butskell. And The Economist said, basically, Mr. Butskell is the man of moderation. So he is the man who is on the left of the Conservative Party, on the right of the Labour Party. He's the consensus man, the mixed economy, Keynesianism, sort of steady as she goes, nothing extreme. He's the centrist dad, I suppose, Mr. Butskell of the 1950s, isn't he? He's the sort of the Rory Stewart character. And ever since, people have sort of said, well, look, the thing about the 50s is that there was this great consensus. The war was over. The welfare state had been built. The NHS had been built and whatnot. The Tories, which is all true, and the Tories didn't really want to upset the apple cart and scrap it and to change things radically. So under Eden and Macmillan, and Butler is a big figure in both of their administrations, there's no real attempt to change the terms of the debate. The debate is settled. It's an age of consensus. And then that continues, that kind of Butskellite consensus. It starts to fall apart, really, late 60s, early 70s. Then it falls apart in a big way across the course of the 70s. And then Mrs. Thatcher comes in 1979. She's all about, get rid, new start. Butskellism was it was kind of fudging and mudging, and she doesn't agree with that. And so then Mr. Butskill kind of belongs to history, but people still slightly, I think there's always a bit of nostalgia for that period because people think, that was a time of serious politicians who'd fought in the war and they would just wanted to come together in the national interest, which is actually a bit of a caricature.
And so the economists you said who coined Butskillites have sort of suggested that we've got a new period of political consensus between Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves, which gives us Heaves, which has a sort of Heaves, which has a slightly sort of vomiting quality to it.
Right. Yeah. Heaves. I'm not sure about Heaves.
No.
Runt. I mean, would runt
Runtelism?
Runtelism is better than Heavesianism. I don't know. We're probably obsessing about the wrong thing here.
But do you think? I mean, because at various points, as you said, that the two sides come together as they did in the 50s, and then drift apart clearly in the 70s, and a lot of difference between left and right through the 80s, but then essentially come together in the 90s. Where are we in that sort of concertina accordion world of politics?
So it's an interesting one. Do you think politics is driven more by? Well, let me ask you a question, Matt. You know as much about politics as anybody, probably far more than me. Do you think politics is driven more by ideas or by material circumstances?
It's an interesting question. That I mean, I think the last 6, 7, 8 years of politics has been so diverted by Brexit and the pandemic that no one's thought they needed an idea, even if they were inclined to have one.
Yeah.
Because the idea was just, well, did you think Brexit was good or bad?
Yeah.
And then everyone had an idea about how to get through that, but none of it based really on ideology or practicalism. It was sort of, putting forward their own personal view. And I think in a way that's why the party structure has fallen apart. Because Brexit gave everyone the right to say, well, no, I want this, and it's this or nothing. And this whole idea of people constantly resigning over things or breaking away or even sort of defecting. The whole point of being in a political party was as a broad church, you went along with most of it. It took a lot for you to pull away from it. And as a result, I think that's fed through to voters as well. Voters absolutely furious about a party that they broadly agreed with. And then one policy comes along and that's the hill they're going to die on. And then they get sort of disconnected from politics altogether because it turns out no one other person agrees with someone entirely.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Although that's a completely different point to your question.
No, Brexit completely detonated a bomb in the existing kind of party system and party allegiances, didn't it? But the reason I ask the question is because I generally think it's circumstances that matter more. And I think ideas are born out of circumstances. So Mr. Butskill, what that Butskillism, I think, reflects is the fact that there had been a sense of national solidarity in the Second World War. Of course, you'd had a coalition government. You had a coalition government in the 30s, and then that continued into become an even more sort of comprehensive coalition to fight the war. So there's a sense of Labour and the Conservatives working together. And actually, the 50s and 60s, it's the affluent society. You come out of rationing. Most people are getting better off. There is more money to spend. Politicians generally, even though they might be ideological small staters, they enjoy spending money because it makes them popular. So I think that Butskillism reflected, frankly, the fact that the balance sheet, the spreadsheets have a lot of black in them and not much red. And I think right now we're living in an age where we do have a new kind of Butskillism, but that is born not so much out of ideological agreement or disagreement, but out of circumstances. There just isn't really very much money to spend. There is no great scope for great ideological experiments. Times are hard. The international circumstances are very anxious. And I think for that reason, we get quite cautious, slightly peevish kind of politics. So obviously the peevishness, we've had a very peevish kind of conservative government in the last few years. assuming Starmer comes in, his government won't really have that much scope to do anything other than tinker, I would say, with what they've inherited from the Conservatives. And I think often consensuses reflect. So the guy called Phil Tinline has a really great book about consensuses and how they change and how they reflect people's ambitions, but also their fears about what not to do, what has gone wrong. I think we probably are entering a period of a new consensus that will be based on a rejection of the 2010s and what people see as the chaos and sort of self-indulgence of the 2010s, with a bigger role for the state, I would guess, than we have been used to. Certainly I first voted in 1997, and in all my sort of childhood, teenage years, and then pretty much all my adulthood, it's been a fairly small state kind of liberal consensus that, governments don't do this, they don't do that, all of that kind of thing. I think we're probably moving towards a more statist period, and where the biggest thing I think is people crave security. They feel they're in a really uncertain, frightening world. They fear decline, I think, and fragmentation. They fear the loss of jobs to Asia. Quite rightly, they fear climate change and all that kind of stuff, and they look to government it's kind of nanny knows best a little bit now. So it's a slightly more
it's also
kind of vibe.
We talked a bit about about Brexit, but the pandemic played a massive part in that. When a big thing hit, the state was there. It paid your wages.
Yeah.
It told you where you could and couldn't go. And people got very used to that. And actually, regardless of some of the conversations happening on the right of the Tory party, the polling for that was overwhelming. People wanted all of that. But I suppose what's really interesting is going into a period of big statism when there isn't any money, and how someone makes that work.
So here's how I think it could easily work, and I can definitely see us moving in this direction. It's not big statism as in the state cannot pay. There was the thing with the utilities bills, wasn't there? The energy bills. But the state can't keep doing that forever. I mean, you can't keep running up debts. But where I think the statism could go is in greater regulation. We already have that. A much more, we were talking about Stanley Baldwin earlier. If you go back 100 years to Baldwin's period, the idea the state would intervene in the details of your life as much as it does now would have been unbelievable. I mean, you think about how much the state intervened in COVID. How closely you could stand together, masks, all of that kind of stuff, and people said, "You're fine. It's a health crisis. Of course, it's an emergency. We have to have all these things." I think we've been conditioned, rather like people were conditioned in world wars, to a level of state intervention, state regulation. And I would be really surprised if Starmer's instincts and those of the people around him are not to move towards a much more regulatory state. Probably more censorious, maybe a bit more puritanical than what we've been used to. Very kind of health and safety and all that kind of thing. I think that'll be the way that the statism manifests itself. We'll be much, much more risk averse, I would imagine, in 5, 10, 20 years' time than we are even now.
And finally, Dominic, before I let you go, because we get obsessed with, which water slide is Ed Davey on today, or what's Angela Rayner said about Keir Starmer, about Diane Abbott. When you or a Dominic Sandbrook comes to write the history of this period in 40, 50 years, what do you think is the overall story, and who are the characters who matter?
Oh, that is a brilliant question. Most of these people will be totally forgotten. So, just looking at the books that I've written on the 70s, which is just by my desk, 60s and 70s, the vast majority of the characters, even the political characters that I've written about, 9 out of 10 people right now, I imagine, would never have heard of. They've just faded into obscurity, and it's only nerds like you and me who have heard of George Brown or I don't know, Geoffrey Rippon, or all these names, people who were proper names at the time, but who cares now? I think now, 40 or 50 years' time, people will always be interested in Boris Johnson because of his a slightly sort of 18th century personality, kind of Falstaffian figure, or sort of people love a character. People will like him. People will always be interested. When I say like him, I mean they'll like reading about him. People will always be interested in Farage. I think he'll be remembered. Ironically, never won an election in Britain. Who else? I mean, will people remember Rishi Sunak? I think he'll be like Sir Alec Douglas Hume. You know, he'll be the guy who was last at the end of the list of. Truss will be. She'll always be remembered, won't she? But for not
a pub, at the very least, a pub quiz question.
But that's exactly how she'll be remembered. She'll be the comic. She'll be Spencer Percival. You know, assassinated. She'll be a comic answer to a quiz question. Of the others, I don't know how many others. I mean, will people remember Jacob Rees-Mogg, Steve Baker, all these other characters? These frankly quite bizarre characters who've been kind of flitting across the screens. I'm not sure they really will. The weird thing about politics, I always think, politicians think a lot about how they'll be remembered, even very senior politicians, especially very senior politicians, I should say. And of course, the answer that they don't want to hear is they won't be remembered at all. Even prime ministers. You know, I think about this a lot because I've given so much of my working life to writing massive books about Ted Heath or Harold Wilson. But it's in recent years, I've become more and more conscious that basically for anybody under the age of 60, maybe, who cares? You know, Harold Wilson and Ted Heath feel like characters from ancient history, but also characters who are not, they're not even very important characters from ancient history. You know, you can tell the story of Britain without them. And I think that'll be the case with almost all of the, you know, John Bercow's name. People won't be banding around the name of John Bercow in the 2070s with in awe. I mean, they won't even heard of him.